Hi, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Maoist-Third Worldist Network. I wanted to begin this broadcast, podcast, video with a little qualification. First, I am not advocating any kind of imperialism or any kind of colonialism or hegemony in what I'm about to say. It might sound like it, and I realize that. And so I wanted to qualify it, and I will continue to qualify it as I go through what I'm about to say. What concerns me when I look at the situation in Mexico, which is just a few miles to my south. I thought it was 3 miles to my south. Somebody corrected me today and said, no, it is only 2 miles to the south. That's all it is, just 2 miles. So I will go by that person's words, since that person has been living here for a very long time, and I've only been here for a little over a year. So just 2 miles to my south, there is tremendous corruption. Much of that corruption is a result of the power of the cartels, the drug smuggling cartels. Those cartels also exist here in the US, although in the US they don't really do any violence per se, at least not typically, because they don't want to be kicked out. So the cartels in the US, the Mexican cartels who have auxiliaries in the US, basically serve as feeders for the drugs in Mexico, and then they distribute that feed, those drugs, to the rest of the United States. And so the average American, including the average Texan, never really has to deal with the cartels. There are all these stories in the media that I keep on reading about and hearing about from people I know who live in other parts of the United States, that somehow this area is filled with crime. No, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not. Now, there is crime like there is anywhere, but is there an unusual amount of crime here? No, at all. So there are many people who are afraid to come to this part of the United States, the Rio Grande Valley, because they think they're going to be victimized by, I don't know, a murderer, a rapist, a robber, somebody. That is not a realistic fear. The people who legitimately fear the cartels are not Americans, at least not Americans who stay in the United States, but they are Mexicans. Mexicans victimizing other Mexicans. That is the situation today in much of Mexico. It is especially pronounced in the border towns, but it's not limited to the border towns. You go to other parts of Mexico, you find it as well. So these problems that exist are ubiquitous throughout the country of Mexico. They have very little impact, if at all, on the average life of the United States citizen or resident living right here in Texas. Now, that's not to say we don't see the cartels. There are people from the cartels who live in this area, who have homes in this area, but they are very difficult to catch. Why? Well, because if they are here, if they have moved here, and if they are living here in Texas, what grounds do you have to stop them, to search them? Like stop and frisk, for example, and ask if they are from one of the cartels. Obviously, they're going to say no. Plus, again, there's that legal issue, which is something that people don't ordinarily think about. How do you stop somebody from a cartel and inquire whether they are in a cartel? You really can't. It's not realistic. It sounds nice. Be nice if that could happen on some level. Get these cartels out of the United States, which would basically prevent the drug money from coming into the US, the drugs themselves from coming into the US, and then spreading to Canada and other parts of the world. But there really is no legitimate, legal way to do that. That's the problem. They're here. They're here right in the city where I live in Mission. They are especially in the neighboring city of Alton, which borders on Mission. But throughout the entire Rio Grande Valley, the cartel members are here. But they simply don't stir up mischief, at least not as a matter of course, because they don't want to attract attention to themselves. Now, if you are an American citizen or resident, and you do travel down to Mexico, you are at risk of being killed. And in some cases, being killed in a very, let's say, a very painful way, without getting into specifics. So it's generally advised by the US government not to go to many different locations in Mexico by Americans or American nationals or American residents, because the chances that you will be killed are fairly high. I mean, I don't know what the percentage is, but any percentage is, to me, too high to see people get harmed in that kind of way. So what can be done? Here's where I would urge caution in what I am about to say. We look at Ukraine and what NATO is doing in Ukraine. Well, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was provoked by NATO. There would have been no Russian invasion of Ukraine if NATO had not done what it did. If NATO had not started incorporating all of these former Warsaw Pact countries into its organization and into the EU, the European Union, there would be no serious problem in Ukraine if Americans had simply minded their own business and simply stayed out of Ukraine. Ukraine was the closest ally that Russia had. What did the US or NATO expect Russia would do if NATO or the US began doing what it did, which is to support a coup d'etat in Ukraine, to place Zelensky in as the new president, a US supported president, a NATO supported president? Did they think that Putin would simply stand by and do nothing? I don't know. Maybe they did. But I find that really, really hard to believe. Really hard to believe. So I don't know what the motivation was or what the specific justification was for doing it. Was NATO simply trying to poke the bear and see what happened? Maybe. If so, that was a really, really bad decision. And we see all of these Ukrainians who have been forced from their homes, many into neighboring countries, many Ukrainians killed because of this war. And who gets blamed? Russia. Now, does Russia not deserve some blame? Yeah, of course. Russia has been killing Ukrainians. That is something which is worthy of condemnation by the international community. But what NATO did in provoking Ukraine and provoking Russia is also worthy of condemnation. And that is something that we very rarely hear. We hear about Russia, those horrible Russians in the Russian government, that monster Putin, and what he is doing in Ukraine. We don't hear about that monster Biden or those monster presidents and other prime ministers in Western countries and NATO countries who provoked Russia to do precisely what it is doing now. So that is the current situation on the ground in Ukraine. Everyone knows about it. We all know about it. The problem is that the media does not give the real reasons for it, generally, unless you go to alternative media sources. Then you might find some of the real answers. But the mainstream media basically repeats the line of the US government, of governments in NATO, and many other non-NATO governments around the world, that it's all Putin's fault, that there was simply no reason for him to go into Ukraine. It was totally unjustified, unprovoked. Complete nonsense. Complete and total nonsense. Regardless, that is not the point of this podcast. The point of this podcast is to point out the hypocrisy of the West, the hypocrisy of the US. Here we are fighting a war in Ukraine. Basically, Ukraine is the proxy of the US, or the proxy more broadly of NATO, I suppose, but primarily the proxy of the US. So NATO is our proxy, fighting the Russian Empire, fighting Vladimir Putin. What about Mexico? What about the cartels in Mexico that are destroying people's lives every day, blowing up homes, blowing up cars, blowing up people, cutting people's heads off ever so slowly? That's what those cartels are doing. Why is there not the same demand by the international community to go in and deal with the cartels? Now, again, reminder, I am not advocating that. I am not advocating imperialism. I am not advocating colonialism. I am not advocating cultural hegemony. So I'm not saying that NATO should go into Russia. I'm sorry, should go into Mexico. But the fact that we have not and the fact that we have gone into Ukraine tells us something about the real motivations at play in the world today. The reason why NATO, the reason why the US is in Ukraine has nothing to do with the Ukrainians. Do you really think that the leaders of the Western world, including Joe Biden, care that much about the people of Ukraine? I don't. I could be wrong. Maybe he does. Maybe they do. I can't read his mind. But the reason why I say that is because it seems to me that if those leaders in the West, in the first world, genuinely cared about the Ukrainian people and how they are currently being attacked by Russia because of a war that itself was provoked by NATO and the US, that they would also be condemning the cartels and would also be assembling an international coalition to go in and fight the cartels. And again, I am not advocating that. I'm not saying that the US, Canada, Europe, whatever, should do that. I don't think that we should. The West, particularly the United States, has caused enough trouble in the world, especially in Latin America. And Mexico is a part of Latin America, as well as being a part of North America. I don't want to see those problems exacerbated. So sending first world NATO troops into Mexico is not the solution. Just like sending NATO troops into Ukraine is not the solution. And yet that's precisely what we are doing. Why? Poking the bear. Making sure that Russia's chief ally, or former chief ally, Ukraine, is no longer on the Russian side, but is on the Western side, on the NATO side, on the American side. I mean, that's what the whole thing is about. That's the reason for the war. It is a proxy war, again, between NATO and Russia, more specifically between the US and Russia. So why is there no war against the cartels in Mexico? Well, I think the answer is obvious. Because US interests, NATO interests, are not furthered or would not be furthered by a war in Mexico. What interests does the US, what interests does NATO have in Mexico? Maybe there are some, but if so, I cannot think of any. So the reason why NATO, and especially the US, are in Ukraine is for purely selfish, regional, nationalistic reasons, and nothing more. There is no justification for not dealing with the cartels, which are also killing people, just like Russians are now killing people in Ukraine. The cartels are killing people in Mexico. But America, NATO, doesn't seem to care. When is the last time you ever saw a story about NATO or the US or some coalition going in and fighting the cartels in Mexico? Well, I can tell you my own experience. Never. I have never seen a story which even argued that point. And so I think we need to deal with reality. Stop being idealistic. Stop thinking that NATO is this wonderful, altruistic body which genuinely cares about the people of Ukraine. It certainly does not. It certainly does not. NATO cares about itself. The United States cares about itself. And NATO is simply an extension of the US empire. So the expansion of the US empire is advantaged in Ukraine. It would not be advantaged in Mexico. And thus, there is no coalition of the willing, going back to a term from more than a decade ago, talking about going into Mexico and fighting off the cartels. Not to say there should be. I'm not arguing for that. I'm simply pointing it out and pointing out the hypocrisy that exists in the Western world right now while fighting Ukraine and ignoring the situation just 2 miles south of where I am sitting right now. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.